one personal element to share is that in a former life of overwork, working at a nonprofit and kind of not having these healthy boundaries, I landed myself, in the hospital with panic attacks, and just really was committed to not pushing myself in the same kind of ways in Roots and Rivers.
Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am very excited to be talking about a really important topic, which is taking a leave of absence as an entrepreneur. And often entrepreneurs are held up as these superhero type people who never take leaves of absence and are just constantly working 24/7. But in reality, entrepreneurs and founders do take leaves of absence all of the time, whether that's for parental leave or that's for an illness or just a sabbatical, or I shouldn't say just a sabbatical, or like a sabbatical or break. And in this episode, I'm really excited to speak with Annelies Tjebbes, the CEO of Roots and Rivers, as well as Hayley Rutherford, senior consultant and operations director, also at that firm. And I've known Annelies now for actually close to a decade. We met when through a national youth gathering, I think back in like 2015, which is hard to believe, a long time ago, when Annelies was at Engineers Without Borders. And we've kept in touch. Annelies has been a consultant to Venture for Canada in various capacities, and we've had a ton of professional engagements. And when I was talking with Annelies recently, after she's kind of transitioned back into her role post being on parental leave, she talked about this topic and how it's something that so many people go through, but there's not necessarily that much content out there on how entrepreneurs navigate this experience. So, Annelies, to get things kicked off, can you describe your experience taking a leave of absence for parental leave, and what did you learn from this experience?
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. Really great to be here. I'll just share quickly that I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and honored to be having this really important conversation today because I think, as you said, people talk about it, maybe dream about it. I'm not actually convinced a lot of people fully do it, and so I'd love to be an inspiration for people to take some time for themselves and for their families or whatever priorities they have going on. So yeah, for myself, I was privileged to get to take 8 months fully offline, didn't read a single email, didn't have any, work related calls in that time, as I was becoming a new mom and figuring out that whole other new role in my life. And then I took 2 months to kind of ramp up and get myself back up to speed a bit, and then 2 months to even kind of redefine my role and contribution to the business. So when you step away, it's really important, I think, to have that reflective moment of what was I doing before and what do I want to be doing now. So it was, I would say, a really liberating experience. It really has been transformative for the business as well. Some people might think there's a lot of fear wrapped up in what could happen and what would you lose as a result of this. And I think honestly, it feels like we gained a lot out of the business. So I'm excited to share all of the various things I learned from kind of how strong my team is and how validated I was in the people I've brought together to do this work with me. How valuable having like strong systems and efficiencies and processes are to set people up for success. How important healthy boundaries are and respecting yourself is. And then how to let go and let others lead and thrive, and how that transforms a business away from being founder-centric to really being kind of that next level of maturity for an organization. So that's a little window in.
That's great to hear that the transition has gone so smoothly and that you're able to disconnect so much during your parental leave. To zoom back a little bit to before you were on parental leave, and let's say like for the 6 month kind of period before you started parental leave, what did it feel like? Like, what were you feeling anxious? Were you like, oh no, I got this? What were kind of the things going through your head?
Yeah, I mean, probably about 6 months before is when I asked the bold question to Hayley of, would you step into this role of interim director and lead the ship in my absence? So I think I felt a lot of nerves around sharing my news with the team. Yeah, so at that time we had just one full-time staff who had just started 6 months before my leave. So basically, exactly at the time I was preparing to share my news, and then we had a team of subcontractors, one of which was Hayley. And so, yeah, I was feeling a little trepidatious of, am I going to be leaving this new teammate, Janani, kind of on her own flying solo as the first employee we've ever hired? Is this asking too much of Hayley? Would this be even something she was interested in? So a lot of thoughts going on in my mind. But I had worked with a business coach prior to that who had kind of said, hey, maybe there's going to be moments in your career or life where you're going to want to take time to step back. And she had really challenged me to say, what would it look like to take a month off or a couple weeks off? And can you build some systems and processes and test that in other ways? So I'd actually a year before that taken 1 month off and tested kind of what would that look like with the team. So I felt like we had some little pilots and trials to see that it might work. So I felt hopeful, but yeah, definitely a lot of pieces to get figured out in that 6 month period, and a lot of trust building, knowledge transfer, that was done between Hayley and I. So yeah, maybe Hayley wants to talk a little about the experience on her end too.
Yeah, I certainly remember we were at our sort of first ever Roots and Rivers retreat. So it was Annelies and our colleague Janani and like a bunch of us who had been freelancing at the time together all on Bowen Island. And yeah, like Annelies and I had kind of like a morning together where we like hiked up a hill and then sat at a cafe and sort of talked about what that could look like for me to step in and steer the ship while she was away. And yeah, it was like it was an interesting time for me. Like I had been, freelancing and working quite substantively like on Roots and Rivers projects and engaging with some of the kind of more internal workings as well, and had a part-time job at the time as well. So it was something that lined up both with where my career was at the time, and like feeling very like I was feeling a very strong connection then as I do now to Roots and Rivers. And so yeah, it was definitely interesting, and like that first conversation to like all the work that we had to do to transition it. But I think it was like, an exciting thing, and where that, anxiety and excitement live in your brain kind of right on the edge there. So I think feeling some of those feelings too.
Thanks so much for sharing your respective experiences. And I think this interview where you're both kind of both sides of the table experience, I think is so intriguing. One thing to zoom in on is that experience of when you, Annalise, gave a speech to the team or communicated the news that you were going to go on parental leave. How did you prepare for that conversation, for that kind of those remarks, and what did you end up saying?
Oh yeah, that feels like forever ago. I'd have trouble remembering exactly, but I think there's a culture of trusting, open communication already within Roots and Rivers. So I think and of bringing your full self to your work. So it's not as if life and work are so separate for us. We share about our personal lives and what's going on for one another. So I don't think it came entirely out of the blue for some people that this might be on the table for me, as I'd probably talked before about building a family and what that might look like. um, I think for me, I went back and forth of, do I share the news before the retreat, so that people, aren't totally derailed in the retreat and what we might focus on at the retreat? Do I share it afterwards? But then would I feel comfortable holding on to that? So I ended up deciding that at the retreat was the right space to do it. And really asking for their input and collaboration around, like, how can we do this effectively? It's not just my decision, and I'm kind of handing it down to folks. It's, yeah, what might this look like to make this an effective transition process, and how would you like to be involved in it? Was also kind of a curiosity and question that I brought both to Hayley and to others in the space. So yeah, I'm sure there was tears shed and and hugs had, and yeah, just a lot of really supportive folks in this community. So I'm so grateful they welcomed my news openly and were keen to figure out how to support me and how to support the business in the transition.
To kind of zoom ahead a little bit in terms of once you actually kind of went on parental leave, I'd love to focus a little bit on Hayley at this point. Hayley, you go into this interim, director role where you're running the organization in a role that you've never, served before in that specific kind of capacity. What did it feel like? What are the challenges? What were the things you found exciting?
Mhm. I think, yeah, as Annelies spoke to, so we had this kind of like 6 months between the news and then her actually taking the time off. And we had 2 really solid months of overlap of being able to sort of go through like point by point all of the things that I didn't have visibility to, like as a contractor working with Roots and Rivers, like earlier in our relationship, like I was very client project focused and like maybe a handful of internal projects, but like things like how does the invoicing work? Like how do we manage contracts? Like all of those kind of unknowns like of the business. So we had this, yeah, like kind of week, every week we would have a different focus of like, okay, this is the week we're going to get all the HR systems sorted. This is the week we're getting all the financial systems sorted. And Annalise had done a huge amount of work in kind of putting all of these like processes from her brain into like a very robust handbook too. So like even I wasn't going to be calling her. So this was like a really excellent reference guide to be able to go back to. And we also were working at the time with a virtual assistant who had been also really integral to setting up Roots and Rivers in a good way. So we had this additional operations support, particularly for things like the finances and some of the like contracting pieces. It was like just so incredibly helpful to be able to rely on Shauna during that time. But yeah, it was still like, I remember like Annalise's last day, it was like sort of like your last call was sort of this like funny like connection with somebody, like a 15-minute call. And then it was kind of the end of the day and we're like, okay, is that it sort of thing? And so I remember like us like getting on the phone and like having a cry about it kind of like, that was like sort of the official handoff. And then it was like kind of full tilt. Like when I look back on that year, it's like a little bit of a blur, like as a lot of like busy transition times like tend to be when you look back on them, because Annalise was departing in August. And so that is kind of the time when our world of consulting with the social purpose sector really starts ramping up. Like people are back from summer holidays, like things are getting busy with like people trying to get strategic plans and things in the can before the end of the upcoming fiscal year, lots of engagements happening. So it was just an incredibly busy time. I think like within like in October, I remember of that year, it was like busy. Like we were like, traveling all over, meeting clients and things like that. So it's like, it is a little bit of a blur. Like I remember feeling like, not that, like it didn't feel like getting thrown into the deep end or anything because I knew everything that was coming up, but it is different when like the buck stops with you and it's your responsibility. And I felt really strongly like my kind of like driving force through that whole year was to really be in a position where I'm supporting all the people around me as best as I could. So we have another full-time colleague, and then we were working and relying very heavily on our network, our ecosystem of independent contractors to support on facilitation and client work too. So that was also just, hugely on my mind too, was like, how do we care for this group of people that Annalise has like assembled and brought together? And as she's reflected, like in the response to the news, like people were very, very supportive of both Annalise's like, opportunity to go and take maternity leave and of me. So I think that was like, just a very like, a solid foundation to build on. But it's very different to like go from thinking you understand how an organization works to then being responsible for how that works and being accountable for how all the things happen. Definitely some tricky moments, but overall it was a very positive experience. I think, we've talked about how would we do it if it was getting, something that we would plan in the future. And I think now we're definitely in a stage of growth where we would probably need a few more brains on the case to fill in all those gaps. I think we know that the processes work sort of regardless of who's implementing them, and that the strength of the team and the strength of the relationships can sustain Roots and Rivers, which was an exciting thing.
It sounds like a blur. Definitely sounds like a busy couple of months. Uh, given that your work as a consultancy and working with not-for-profits and charities and other social impact organizations across Canada, it's such a relationship-driven work. And Annalise has a huge amount of relationships in the sector all across Canada. But in my own experience, where I run a charity, which also is like relationships matter a ton, I can relate to. It's not like you can just like kind of, oh, I'm handing off all these relationships in like a little box for this other person to take over. Hayley, how did you, I guess Hayley and Annalise, whoever wants to go is, but how did you navigate that relational handoff?
Mhm. That was definitely one of the more challenging pieces of it. Like, just like you said, it's like you can't just be like, cool, I'm stepping away, like, treat this person as though you would treat me. It's not something we can do. You don't have the history, you don't have the rapport with people. So, as part of Annalise's transition process, like, we were, trying to start cultivating some of those key relationships, particularly with people who have been long-term supporters and kind of strategic referrers for the business. And so there's like a process of both introducing the idea that Annalise was taking maternity leave and that I would be stepping in, and then inviting some conversation to kind of check in before that transition happened. So that did result in, me being able to build some relationships, some stronger relationships with our client community that I hadn't necessarily had before. I also sort of subbed in for Annalise. We're part of a mastermind group of other social purpose business owners who are based in BC. So they were able to kind of take me under their wing as well, which was really helpful. And so, in the absence of Annalise, like, this group of other business owners was able to provide mentorship, and then also to facilitate some of those like relationship pieces as well, because they're also like other organizations that work kind of in similar consulting kind of spaces, like marketing, market analysis, and like legal support for the social purpose sector. So they were also able to kind of extend themselves to support me in my relationship building. Because another piece is that Annalise is based in BC and I am based in Ontario, and so there is like a local piece to that relationship building too. I can't just like start showing up at events in Vancouver and start building those connections myself. Also, this was happening in parts of the pandemic where things were a little bit more locked down as well. So the way we're building relationships was definitely changing at the time. So it was definitely a challenging piece. Like, there are parts that it doesn't exactly translate like one to one, because you'll just never have the history with those folks that Annalise will have. But I think we did a pretty solid job of trying to like introduce me as the person, and I was able to build some great relationships as a result of that. And then also in like my sort of limited extra time that I had during the role. But I do have a strong relationship like network here in Kitchener-Waterloo area where I am. So we're able to like build a little bit more of like an Ontario footprint as well, like kind of during that time. So that's something that we're still exploring, like what that looks like to have different leadership within Roots and Rivers, like be situated in different parts of the country. But yeah, the relationship stuff is huge, and it's something that when Annalise came back to, there was also kind of this reintroduction of, hey, Annalise is back, and that led to lots of really interesting work when she returned. So I think that also speaks to like, you can do your best to build those connections during that time, but there will always be like that comfort and ease that comes with those really strong long-term relationships. And so as when she was back, it was like, oh yeah, you could kind of feel that maybe sigh of relief or like peak of interest in a way. For her return, that wasn't quite there for me.
And it was so intelligent how you structured it, where you had that overlap period where you could at least kind of get to know folks a little bit, and it wasn't just like, oh, by the way, this is the new person. I think that overlap makes so much sense. And to your point, though, it's not that you're like a clone of Annalise. Obviously, you're like a different person, and it's them getting to know you, but it's also them accepting you're not the exact same as Annalise, and that's okay. Annalise, to zoom back a little bit to something you talked about before, which I think is really interesting, is the boundaries that you were able to have through your parental leave. I know a lot of different entrepreneurs who they go on parental leave, and it's sometimes for a couple weeks, like it's super short, and then they're like back at it, emailing away. I have a friend right now who is 3 months into her parental leave, and she's on parental leave but doing like a lot of contract work, and just like I would say not really having that boundaries between work and kind of life. How were you able to kind of resist that temptation and really have those strong boundaries? Because I can imagine both there's potentially pressure from clients or texts coming in and different things, but also that they might have been tempting too for you to want to check in.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Um, I mean, one personal element to share is that in a former life of overwork, working at a nonprofit and kind of, not having these healthy boundaries, I landed myself, in the hospital with panic attacks, and just really was committed to not pushing myself in the same kind of ways in Roots and Rivers. So it's always been a practice with Roots and Rivers around healthy boundary setting and managing ambition and scope and everything. So that's always been really important for me. But then I know myself and the ambition and passion that I have for the business. And so I actually had to do some hacks of like, I got our virtual assistant to change the password to my email so that I couldn't get into it. I deleted my email app from my phone. I packed up my desk. I put a cloth on top of it. I put art on top of it. I made it like a different structure in the home. And so I really was not feeling like, oh, I'm tempted. Maybe I should check what's going on. And I think like huge gratitude and kudos to Hayley for granting me that, because I think it could have easily fallen into her checking in with me or asking things. And by building that handbook, I really tried to make sure that if there was questions, she had somewhere to go to, but also having virtual assistant, having other teammates around or mentors that could support her. I was hoping that I could set that boundary and that that could be respected and supported. And I'm so grateful that it was. And I think people fear letting go and what's going to happen and needing to have some input or control. And I think Roots and Rivers has transformed and evolved and grown in really beautiful ways as a result of Hayley's leadership, as a result of me stepping back. And so it's been such a gift. Like, I think we are in a better position as an organization than if I hadn't been on leave, which is kind of a bold or unusual thing to say, with a founder taking almost a year off to build a family. And so I think I built some hacks. I got the team really bought into that. And if things had been in crisis and Hayley had called me up, I'm not going to reject her phone calls. But I really appreciate it. And we had some just like more personal chats and calls, just because we also care about each other as people. And I wanted to introduce her to my little one, Orson, as well. So that was important to me too. But it really felt like we were able to keep it more on the personal side than the business side.
That's awesome to hear, and I think is so impressive to be able to have that boundary and that time to really focus. And it's such a special time too in it, like a parent and child's like life, to be able to be so present for it. I think is something special. When you talk about how it evolved your thinking, can you double click a little bit on that, Annelies? How did taking such like an immersive kind of leave change your view or evolve your view on work and life? And also, like, in that time, did it evolve your thinking on like the very nature of your business?
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of the ways that processes happen in the business have evolved. So Hayley and Janani came up with some new ways of doing things while I was gone, such as a monthly process reflection around like, what do we mean by this, or how do we do this element? And it's now been woven in and become like a really beautiful practice that we look forward to monthly, of intentional reflection and checking in on how we do our work. So I think it forced me and allowed me to be more open to other ways of doing things. When you're the founder, you can kind of say like, oh yeah, it's my organization, I'm doing things. And especially with a really small team, like I think as we continue to grow, I will need to let go, and I will be excited to let go more and let other people's leadership thrive and define kind of how we do things and our direction. But I was forced to do that in this time. And I think that allowed the business to develop new processes and ways of working while I was gone. And I actually felt a little bit like I had to get re-onboarded to my own business, which was a funny experience as well. But kind of, how have you guys brought your own brilliance to the table and evolved how we might do things, and how can I learn from that? And then how also has me decentering myself from the business, how can that live on both in the systems and processes and how we do things, but also in, as you mentioned, those relationship building pieces? Like, I don't have to be at the table for people to feel confident in Roots and Rivers, because Hayley's there or Janani's there or one of our subcontractors are there. So we've redefined, this did start as my solo journey, being an independent consultant, and has evolved into a thriving business that is a team and not just one person's identity. So that's really, this circuit breaker of me being off has helped reinforce that for me and helped us kind of grow to this new level of maturity as a business.
Sometimes time off can really help clarify things and put things in perspective, and also just to change it up, to have different people doing the processes and the principal activities, and to kind of question, oh, should we be doing this? Can we change it? Can we make things better? One thing you talked about, Annelies, is that post leave kind of integration. Can you describe for the listeners, what was that like? What were the first kind of 3 months? What were the joys? What were also the challenges?
That was a wacky time. I felt like kind of maybe like I was in a pinball machine where I was just a little everywhere. I think I was coming back both trying to figure out, like, how do you work when you have a baby? When do you find time for this? And so that, figuring that piece out, but then also really like, what is my role and where should I be focusing my energy? I also came back in our fallow season, our slower season. So our summer is a bit more of a kind of time for internal processes and reflections. And so I was like, great, sure, I can work on that. And then a couple of weeks or maybe a month into that, realized like, oh, should I be more focused on business development? Because that hasn't been able to be as much of a focus while I was off around that relationship building piece. So I kind of felt like I was just a little all over the place. And yeah, hindsight, I'm not totally sure how we could have structured that differently, but I think it just needed to be a little bit of messy time to just figure ourselves out again. And I'm very grateful that Hayley agreed to stay on and join as a full-time permanent staff member, because that's really helped us now evolve. Like, what is my unique role? What is her role? What is Janani's role? How are we each bringing our leadership in different areas? So we've had also now basically a year since I've been back to kind of grow into that. But yeah, it was a messy time, but I think Hayley and I are pretty good at having open and vulnerable conversations with each other and talking through. Like, there was some stepping on each other's toes, but we had calls about it. We talked it out, and I think our relationship has strengthened as a result of them.
Hayley, I'd love to hear about your experiences as well during this transition. What was it like for you? You were running the show, you were the director, and then Annelies comes back, and she's now the CEO again. What was that experience like for you in terms of the transition?
Yeah, I think as we were approaching it, I was like kind of naively hoping for like this feeling of relief when she was gonna come back, like on back and be part of the team again, of like, oh great, like we'll have another brain on this work again, like there'll be a bit more ease in terms of like knowing what we can manage as a team, and not so much like negotiation with so many other like actors like in our space. So but I don't think I had really put enough effort into like that sort of re-onboarding process. And so like, yeah, very hindsight 2020 reflections, that I think Annelies needed a lot more clarity of coming back, of like where to put some of that energy. And the other thing about the nature of consulting work too is that, again, that relationship piece too. So we were in the mix with all of these clients who, like, for them, Roots and Rivers is me and Janani and some of our great ecosystem members. Like, Annelies wasn't necessarily like part of their world of Roots and Rivers. And it also doesn't always make sense to start subbing in people like on contracts, like on client projects where we have these established relationships and the work is going well. So there was also this sort of like lag of like, okay, the next round of projects that we're going to start to land, like that's this piece where Annelies can get more integrated meaningfully back into the client work. So that was going to take some time. And then, yeah, Annelies like loves Roots and Rivers. This is like her first non-human baby, and like something that she's been building since 2018. And she has a lot of passion and a lot of excitement and energy in all sorts of facets of the business. So there was a lot of time that she was spending like thinking about what all of those things could do, but we weren't really in a place to like receive all of that and figure out what to do with it. So that was definitely like a tricky process. It was like, I think I had been so like the, you know, thinking about the process like the whole way through, like now I would have focused so much more energy at that transition point rather than the initial phases of like taking on everything, because that was like much more smooth, because it was much more straightforward, right? Of like, I'm going to take on her role, I'm stepping in, things will change and we'll adapt. But then like this very unknown piece of like coming back to something that you founded and it's like different, like what have these people been doing here in my like sandbox this whole time? Not that that was like the energy, but it's like it is different to, you know, be re-onboarding somebody, like welcome back to this thing you made. Like here's what we've done with it over the past 8 months. So yeah, it was definitely a tricky time, and like yeah, we had to have a lot of like very open conversations about it. And I remember, you know, I might be in conversation with like friends or family about sort of like the messiness and some of the stickiness of that time, and they would be like, oh, like, well, you know, are you able to talk about this? I was like, oh yeah, I said all of this to Annelies like seconds ago, like on the phone. And people were really quite amazed, I think, by that, of like maybe the openness with which we were able to navigate it. And I think too, like the idea of me coming on in a full-time role wasn't something that emerged during that transition. That seed had sort of been planted like even before Annelies was taking that leave. So I think there was like, you know, some sense that I was also part of the way that Roots and Rivers was growing. So there is this space, like a maybe more complex space to figure out like how two sort of more senior leadership people within an organization are going to work, rather than just handing it all back to somebody. And so I know that that's like a feature. Like if you look at most job postings for the social purpose sector, it'll be 12 to 14 month full-time contracts. And you sort of can make the assumption that that's somebody subbing in for a parental leave. And often there isn't a place for that person within the organization once that leave is over. So I think that was also something that was really unique, that it was part of the growth strategy of Roots and Rivers to stick around. And that gave us like more time to figure out like that reintegration piece than we might have had in another context.
Congrats on having such a smooth transition, and for all the learnings through the process. One thing I think that is interesting for listeners to learn a little bit about is what didn't work. Like when you reflect on kind of this experience, what is like one regret that you have, and what would you do differently?
Yeah, I can share one regret was kind of the financial burden that Hayley sat with. So I did build a reserve in the business before I left in order to be able to support us to have that security, and also to be able to provide myself compensation while I was on leave. But I think maybe Hayley was still feeling this pressure of like, I want to still demonstrate that we can be profitable or get, you know, acquire revenue in the same way without Annelies. And I think, yeah, like we set some targets and things. And in hindsight, like all I really wanted was for this thing that I built to not die while I was gone, and for these people to not feel, yeah, this intense stress holding this up for me. And so I think if we had been able to like dial back any expectations and really just, yeah, make sure that Hayley didn't feel kind of pressures around that, that would have been, I think, yeah, might have smoothed things out a little bit. Because yeah, I know that there were some tough moments, and that's also a little bit the reality of consulting, is that it ebbs and flows, and that I had gotten used to that over 5 years of doing that before, and had the trust and confidence of like, yeah, maybe we're not landing that much work today, but we'll land it next month and it'll settle out. And Hayley maybe didn't have that same comfort or experience around that. And so, yeah, that I'm sure could feel quite unsettling. And so, yeah, in hindsight, I would have, yeah, either provided more context or set expectations differently, or figured out what would it mean for Hayley to flag some of those issues, and for us to brainstorm them together, which we did a little bit. But yeah, Hayley, curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, definitely having like a reintegration plan and having spent a lot more thoughtful time thinking about what it would look like when Annalise came back and like what would make sense for her to get involved in, particularly like as she was kind of like doing this like graduated return to work plan. And yeah, trying to yeah, kind of like bring some more ease to that process because that was definitely the much stickier end, I guess, of the leave. Like the coming back was more challenging than her leaving. I think in another couple of reflections I would share, like we had a sense of like, okay, like we know Annalise does all these things with the business. What are some of the ways that we can backfill? So my role is a piece of that. Because we live in two different cities, like we were really prioritizing things like trying to find people who would be able to like sub in for in-person facilitation for client projects and things like that. So we had these assumptions about the kind of support that we would need, and that did not really turn out to be the kind of support we needed. It's like we did have the people to rely on for some of those like really important like face-to-face client engagements, but I felt the loss kind of my own role that I had played in Roots and Rivers before, like a more senior person on client projects. Because just the way the timing worked out, we have an amazing full-time staff person who had been on the team for a short amount of time who stepped up in a huge way, like something like above and beyond like what people are normally, you know, accomplishing and being responsible for like in a more junior role in the first year as an organization. But that sort of like the lack of kind of like a senior person to be like, oh great, I think I can probably just like punt that to them and they will, you know, be able to carry it and do what's needed. So I think that was another like kind of a space that we could have put some more intention into like filling there. Just the kind of like the right level of support at the right time is a really complicated thing to try to predict. And so yeah, looking back, those are some of the things we might have done differently.
And navigating founder transitions, whether it's temporary or permanent, I think is one of the most complicated things an organization can deal with. It's a very complicated and tricky thing, and I think those are two really tactical suggestions that listeners can take in terms of if they're considering going on a leave or are in situations where they have to prepare for a founder transitioning. To kind of close things out, do you have any final thoughts, reflections, advice for listeners on how to navigate these kinds of situations?
Yeah, I think as much preparation as you can do, like, especially on a small team, like, if you've got if you're holding a lot of processes in your brain and it's not documented or articulated in a meaningful way for your team members, like, that's a really great place to start, like, trying to figure out all the things that you're doing and how you might be able to share that load across different roles, whether that's like someone coming in like a one-to-one way to replace you, or if you're going to kind of be spreading that over the team. The relationship transitions, so whether that's like getting people more invested, like whether you're like bringing people into like sales and business development calls to kind of start building some of those relationships, and and then I guess like also being like aware that like that is also not something that's like super easy to transition, but it is worth making the effort for like the small percentage of those relationships that will like become meaningful for whoever is replacing you. um, think about how you're going to come back in a way that we didn't and maybe learned the most about. So yeah, like, are you going to be returning from leave in like, 5 hours a week, grading up to 40 over the course of like a handful of weeks? And what does that look like? And maybe putting some structure into that before leaving of like, okay, here's what I think I might need just as a place to park some of those ideas. And I think, yeah, just sort of managing expectations about what is going to happen during your leave too. So I think it's like we want to be doing better than just surviving, like maybe not fully onto the thriving spectrum, like somewhere in between those things. And so, but sort of setting some expectations and managing around that. And then for people who are coming in to replace, I think really look for the kind of mentorship and support in your own network that you can lead on. So we had the mastermind group. I did some professional coaching during that time as part of my professional development. And that was huge to be able to, because you're like probably losing the person you would ask those high level questions to when that founder is taking the leave. So being able to have somebody to go to or some buddies to go to be like, is this happening? And like some of the most grounding stuff for me was like in this mastermind group, like amazing business owners who've been running the business for 15 years having the same questions I had about what I was doing 6 months into the job. I was like, great, everyone has this question. Perfect. So yeah, to just find some community to support you like during that time, and that kind of like peer mentorship relationships were really, really huge for me stepping in. And yeah, I think those are some takeaways and reflections, and hopefully that's helpful for folks who are listening.
Thanks, Hayley. While I was pregnant, one thing that my midwife kept saying to me was trust your body, trust your baby. And that became kind of a mantra for me to help like calm any anxieties I had during pregnancy and labor. And here I would kind of say like, trust your team, trust your business, trust yourself. And I think that trust piece really shone through. It enabled me to have those boundaries and not be micromanaging or trying to jump in or check in on how things were going, and to just trust that like I'd built something that could sustain this impact. And like we talked about before, it much more than sustained. Like it has grown and thrived. You know, Hayley didn't celebrate or share this, but we had our highest revenue generating year the year that she was in the leadership. And so, you know, while there was bumps along the way and some things were harder than others, we still had a really successful time and have like really grown and strengthened since then. So I just encourage people to have hope for these kind of possibilities, to like work through your fears, to figuring out, you know, what are you afraid of letting go of, and how can you do this, and how can you do this in a really comprehensive way? Like how can we challenge that tendency of like, I'm still going to check my emails, or I'm still going to, you know, wonder what's going on, and just be in the moment and enjoy the experience of whatever you might be taking, enjoy or manage the experience of whatever you might be taking a leave for. I realize sometimes it's not a positive experience to be taking a leave. So just giving yourself that time and energy to focus. That systems and processes piece, kind of building those early and often, and then also testing them, like that advice from my business mentor around take a month off in case, you know, sometimes you might, at some point you might need to do that or want to do that, and test what that feels like and what breaks when you're gone. So that advice was really salient for me and helped us test some of that in the earlier days. Just really encourage people to give it a shot, to consider it. The entrepreneurial journey doesn't have to be a grind where you're feeling exhausted and burnt out and like all of your heart and soul is poured into this. We can set boundaries around that as well, and it can be a really positive thing for a business.
Annelies and Hayley, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on such an important topic. As you were alluding to, Annelies, I think that this is a relevant conversation for folks going on longer leaves, but also people going on even like a couple week vacation, or even a lot of entrepreneurs, in my experience, just struggle to disconnect on the weekends. And I think inherent to a lot of entrepreneurs is this sense that they are often indispensable, which is a false sense in most cases. And most people are way more indispensable than they realize, including founders. Annelies and Hayley, I think you provided a ton of super practical and actionable tips. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much to you as well. And thanks to Hayley for stepping into this role. And thanks to my family and friends who also supported this journey as well. So it's been a beautiful one, and glad to share it with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.